In the first two videos, we established the visible structure of the road to 1914. Imperial rivalry, alliance rigidity, naval competition, and the Balkan fault lines. A Europe tense enough that catastrophe became possible. Now we approach the most distinctive and controversial claim of hidden history. The authors argue that behind Britain's formal government there operated what they call a secret elite, an informal Anglo-American network shaping policy towards war. The book opens with a very strong accusation that the accepted history of World War I is a constructed narrative, a deliberately concocted lie. They argue that Versailles fixed blame on Germany, and that this verdict shaped modern memory. But their most distinctive thesis is that Britain itself was not merely drawn into the war, but pushed toward it by a small governing network. They write that Europe was ambushed by what they describe as a secret cabal, operating especially in London. They connect this to imperial circles founded in the late 19th century, linked to Cecil Rhodes, Alfred Milner, and Lord Rothschild, and described by historian Carol Quigley. This is the book's thesis in stark form, a hidden continuity of imperial policy, operating beyond democratic visibility. Now, before reacting to the language of secret elite, we should acknowledge something obvious. Informal power exists. Foreign policy has never been shaped solely by public debate. Empires have always relied on private diplomacy, elite schools and networks, financial interests, strategic clubs and committees, institutions that outlast elections. It is not radical to say that governing classes coordinate. That is what governing classes do. Britain was an imperial system. Its policymakers were not ordinary citizens randomly selected. They were drawn from narrow circles: aristocracy, finance, the Foreign Office, imperial administrators, military planners. So, the somber version of the author's insight is this: World War I cannot be understood purely through democratic surface narratives. It emerged within elite strategic cultures. This is plausible. This is historically grounded. But caution matters, because there is a difference between saying foreign policy is shaped by elite networks and saying a secret society orchestrated the war. The first is institutional history. The second risks becoming total explanation. Large events like World War I have multiple causes. Alliance structures, mobilization timetables, nationalist pressures, imperial competition, miscalculation, and yes, elite strategy. If one compresses all of this into a single hidden cabal, one loses complexity. And complexity matters because it is the difference between analysis and mythology. A responsible reading of hidden history therefore requires discipline to extract what is valuable without turning history into omnipotent puppetry. So what is the deeper value of this book? Even if one is cautious about some of its framing, it forces a serious question. How does war become thinkable? Who decides that rivalry must be resolved through force? Who benefits from escalation? Who has access to decision-making? Who controls the narrative afterward? World War I was obviously not demanded by peasants. It was not voted for by trench soldiers. It was made within governing institutions. And this is where the book connects to a larger theme: war as administration. The danger is not only hatred, the danger is managerial doctrine, the belief that catastrophe is necessary. This is what Hayek means by inevitability. This is what Chomsky means by primacy. This is what hidden history, in its own provocative way, is trying to illuminate. So how should one read hidden history? Not timidly, not dismissively, and not as if the authors are merely playing with rhetoric. Because whether one agrees with every claim or not, they are doing something real. They are tearing open the sealed story we have inherited. They are saying, World War I was not simply a tragic misunderstanding. It was not simply a Balkan spark. It was not simply an inevitable domino chain. It was also a product of empire, a product of strategy, a product of institutions that think in terms of decades, not elections. And this is the book's challenge. Stop imagining that wars begin only when publics demand them. Wars begin when ruling systems decide they are useful, or necessary, or inevitable. Hidden history insists that the official narrative is incomplete, that behind the speeches and headlines there were private meetings, elite circles, imperial planners, elite scheming, and long-standing assumptions about Britain's place in the world. The authors want you to see history from the inside of power, not from the outside of ceremonies. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. Power is often quieter than we imagine. It rarely announces itself. It operates through continuity, through networks, through men who never appear on ballots, but who shape what ballots will later inherit in the shadows of power. So the right way to read this book is not to treat it as mythology, but also not to treat it as harmless provocation. Read it as an accusation. Read it as an excavation. Read it as a reminder. Modern war is not simply chaos. It is administration. So the secret elite thesis is provocative, but by the time you finish Hidden History, the authors are not speaking vaguely. They are making a specific historical accusation. They argue that Britain's road to war was shaped not simply by Parliament, not simply by open democratic debate, but by a tight imperial network operating through London. They point again and again to certain circles, the Rhodes Milner Group, the Round Table movement, elite imperial strategists clustered around finance, the press, and the Foreign Office. They claim that these men did not need to control everything in some cartoon sense. They only needed access. They only needed continuity. They needed to be in the rooms where assumptions are formed, where foreign policy becomes tradition, where the range of acceptable options is narrowed long before the public ever hears the question. This is why the authors lean so heavily on Quigley, because Quigley himself described an Anglo-imperial network, one that believed that the British Empire must be preserved, and that global power required coordinated strategy across generations. Hidden History takes this framework and pushes it directly into 1914. They argue that Britain was not dragged into war reluctantly at the last moment. They argue that war was seen within these imperial circles as strategically necessary to contain Germany, necessary to preserve naval supremacy, necessary to protect the architecture of empire. And that is what makes their claim so unsettling. Not that history was secretly controlled like puppetry, but that the most important decisions were being shaped inside elite institutions whose priorities were imperial, not democratic, and whose timeline was decades, not elections. This is the core argument of Hidden History, that World War I was not only a tragedy of alliances, but also the culmination of an imperial strategic culture, operating with remarkable continuity beneath Britain's public government. So who were these men? When Docherty and MacGregor speak of a secret elite, they are not imagining a cartoon society in robes. They are pointing to something far more historically real, an imperial governing class with continuity, with networks and with access. At the center of their story is the late Victorian imperial project associated with Cecil Rhodes. Rhodes was not simply a businessman or a colonial adventurer. He was a man with an explicit political vision: that Britain's global supremacy must be preserved, and that Anglo power should shape the future world order. Around Rhodes emerged a circle of imperial strategists. After his death, that circle continued through figures like Alfred Milner, a senior administrator of empire, High Commissioner in South Africa, and a central organizer of what the authors describe as an enduring imperial network. This is why the book repeatedly returns to what later became known as the Milner Group. Not because they controlled everything, but because they occupied key junctions in colonial administration, in elite education. In fact, there's still such a thing as the Rhodes Scholarship, in journalism, in strategic planning, and in the Foreign Office world. Docherty and MacGregor argue that these were the kinds of men who did not need formal office to shape policy, because policy is often shaped before it becomes public. They also connect this network to the Round Table movement, an imperial coordinating circle in the early 20th century, committed to maintaining Britain's position through federation, alliance, and strategy. And they lean on the historian Carroll Quigley. And Quigley himself described an Anglo-imperial establishment, a network whose influence operated through institutions rather than elections. Carroll Quigley wrote a few tomes in his lifetime, which you might be familiar with. One is The Anglo-American Establishment. The other is Tragedy and Hope. So the claim of hidden history is not simply, secret men caused the war. The claim is sharper, that Britain's governing world contained an imperial strategic continuity, a class of policymakers, administrators, financiers, editors, and planners who saw Germany's rise as an existential challenge, and who believed war might just be the necessary resolution. This is the book's real target, not conspiracy as fantasy, but empire as structure, not puppets, but networks, not a single plot, but an elite world whose assumptions became policy, and whose policy became catastrophe. So how, concretely, would such a circle shape policy? This is where hidden history wants the reader to think institutionally, because the authors are not claiming that a few men issued secret commands to a nation. They are claiming something more plausible, that foreign policy in an imperial state is not primarily made in public. It is made through access, through assumptions, through the control of information, and through the narrowing of choices long before Parliament votes. First, the book emphasizes the world of private diplomacy. In the early 20th century, Britain's most important negotiations were not conducted transparently. They were conducted through elite diplomatic channels, through understandings, through commitments that the public often did not fully know existed. Policy, in other words, was shaped before it was announced. Second, the authors focus on elite institutional continuity. The same narrow circles dominated: Foreign Office, Imperial Administration, Oxbridge networks, exclusive clubs, and the governing press. Foreign policy was not drawn from mass democratic life. It was an inheritance, a professional culture of empire. Third, they argue that strategic framing was decisive. The question was not, should Britain fight? The deeper question was, what must Britain do to remain Britain? And within imperial circles, Germany's rise was interpreted as a systematic threat to naval supremacy, to imperial trade routes, to Britain's position as the central world power. So the war becomes thinkable not because anyone loves war, but because rivalry is translated into necessity. Fourth, hidden history suggests that dissent was managed, not necessarily crushed by force, but marginalized through consensus. The range of respectable opinion narrowed, certain assumptions became unquestionable, and once that happens, policy begins to move with a momentum of its own. Finally, the authors argue that the narrative afterward was just as important as the decisions before, because after catastrophe, someone must explain it. Someone must fix the blame. Someone must tell the story that will be remembered. Versailles was not only a treaty, it was also a verdict, and verdicts shape history. So the mechanism the book is pointing toward is this: empire does not require a single mastermind. Empire requires institutions that reproduce strategic necessity, networks of access, continuity of elites, private commitments, managed narratives. And out of that world, modern war emerges, not as chaos, but as policy. Part of the treaty, imposed on a Germany still starving under blockade, was the demand that Germany formally accept guilt for the war, not simply responsibility, but guilt. This was not a minor clause. It was a moral verdict written into international law, and once a verdict is declared, history begins to harden around it. Because if one nation must confess, then others need not examine themselves. The catastrophe becomes a crime with a single author, rather than a system with many architects. So I want to close with this. What hidden history is really asking us to confront is not a fairy tale of omnipotent conspirators, but the way empire actually works, through networks, through private diplomacy, through institutions that shape policy long before public ever hears the word war. Rhodes, Milner, the Foreign Office world, the strategic assumptions of a ruling class. Whether one agrees with every single edge of the author's case or not, their challenge is serious. That World War I cannot be understood only from the outside, from speeches, treaties, and ceremonies, but from the inside of power. And in the next episode, we move from thesis to evidence. What do the authors actually point to? What mechanisms do they claim operated in Britain before 1914? And how should we judge it? Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video on Hidden History, the secret origins of World War I.